Hello, Professor. Nice to have you here in Warsaw, in Świetlica Wolności. You came here straight from not Iceland, but from France, right?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I was organizing a conference in Paris about Balzac and capitalism because my interest in Balzac was aroused when I read Thomas Piketty's famous book, Capital in the 21st Century, where he said that we were basically getting into a situation similar to what Balzac had described in the 19th century, where capital was clinging towards people and families and not being dispersed. And I read Pierre Goriot that he quotes extensively in the book, and I came to the conclusion that this is totally wrong, because what Balzac actually describes in his book, Pierre Goriot, is both the frailty of man, but also the fragility of capital. Because most of the protagonists in the book are people who are short of money, who are desperate because they have spent money on all kinds of passions. There is the old Goriot, who loves his daughters excessively, and he has basically used up all his money in helping them. Yeah. There is the lovers of the daughters, they are gamblers and adventurers. There is the son-in-law of his, Baron de Nucingen, who has tied up all his money in speculation, and so on. So if you just go through the novel, what you see is how precarious capital is. It's not clinging to people like it's being glued to them, not at all. It's something that where there's a challenge to try to keep it.
Economy is something dynamic, not static, right?
Absolutely, and we see this even better today than in Balzac's time, because if you look at the list of the richest people in the world that Forbes publishes regularly, then most of them nowadays are self-made. It's not inherited wealth. Although I also argue that there is nothing wrong with having inherited wealth, because that goes for continuity, some accumulation of cultural capital. You have people of leisure who can go to the opera, who can sponsor painters, who can collect books and old wines and live a life of high culture. And there is nothing wrong with that, because it doesn't harm anyone else.
You are quite optimistic about free market capitalism, right?
Yes, I am, because I think it has unleashed the creative forces of individuals and entrepreneurship.
I found, or I read a lot of articles referring to you as a neoliberal. Do you identify yourself with this label?
Well, I have actually, to tell you the truth, I have really nothing against being identified as a neoliberal, because the word itself isn't in any way negative. If you mean by neoliberalism the intellectual and political movement which arose more or less in the 1980s and had two intellectual mentors, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, and two practicing politicians, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, with also things, liberalization in many other countries such as Chile and New Zealand. If that's what you mean by neoliberalism, then I'm happy to be one of those people.
Neoliberalism is nothing bad.
No, not in my book, not at all. So I have no problems with it. And I think, actually, that this was something, this movement, it really saved the free world. The free world regained its self-confidence under the leadership, the political leadership of Reagan and Thatcher. And Thatcher actually turned England or the United Kingdom around. It had been the sick man of Europe, and suddenly it became a vibrant economy of growth and self-confidence. And Reagan did the same with the United States. And needless to say, here in Poland, we all know that there were three people who basically won the Cold War. It was Karl Wojtyła, and Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher. In fact, a friend of mine, John O'Sullivan, he has written a book about the three people who won the Cold War. So if this is what people mean with neoliberalism, then I'm proud to be a neoliberal.
You're proud to be neoliberal, but mostly when people use this term, they use it with the negative connotations. They say that neoliberalism brought us here, and they mean by here the place full of inequality, full of, say, environmental pollution, full of poor people in third world countries. This is, in their optics, this is something very bad, and the outcome is the result of neoliberalism. And I'm asking you about that specifically because if we go back like 10 years, 12 years right now, to the crisis, financial crisis 2008, 2009, and to Iceland, to your home country, one could ask a question: how one can be a neoliberal after specifically this kind of crisis that Iceland lived through. What I mean is that you have this overgrown financial sector, you have this banks with no responsibility, with no skin in the game in your country, but your government was obliged to pay for their losses when they obviously lost in the market. Your government was about to cover the losses. And then there was some kind of a change when you won this court case against probably Holland, was it? Holland and Great Britain, and some of those institutions gave the money back to you. But general situation was that you had a great decline in GDP because of the fact that your financial system was very, very susceptible to crisis, due to being very open. So to put it shortly, how can you be neoliberal after such experiences?
Well, you're asking a lot of questions, and we could take them one after another. One is inequality, another one is environmental destruction, the third is Iceland, the fourth is poverty.
Let's focus on this crisis first, on 2008.
Yes. Okay, and first let us be clear about one thing. The financial crisis of 2008 was mainly because the American Federal Reserve kept interest rates artificially low, and at the same time led to overblown mortgages in the housing sector. And this pumped money into the economy, and the financial sector didn't know how to price the bonds that resulted out of this correctly. So there was a credit crunch. That's basically what happened elsewhere. But you are referring to Iceland. And then there are a lot of things that we have to put right. First, I don't think there is any such thing as too big a banking sector in Iceland. The Icelandic banking sector, which was about between 8 times GDP, was no bigger than, for example, the banking sector in Scotland, which was 12 times GDP, or the banking sector in Switzerland, which was 10 times GDP, or the banking sector in Cyprus, which was 8 times GDP. So I don't think we can really blame the crisis in Iceland on the size of the banking sector. But what was the crucial difference, for example, between the Swiss banking sector and the Scottish banking sector and the Icelandic one? That's very interesting. Why didn't they collapse like the Icelandic one? And the reason why they didn't collapse was that they were bailed out. The Scottish banking sector was bailed out by the Bank of England, and the Swiss banking sector, and that's very interesting, was bailed out by the American Federal Reserve System. And in return for bailing out the Swiss banking system, they got information about bank accounts by American citizens in Swiss banks. All this has been documented in reports, so I'm not revealing anything here. But the Icelanders were refused any liquidity assistance.
Your government?
Yes. And the question is, why was that? Why, for example, did the American Fed give liquidity assistance in the form of dollar swap deals to the central banks of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, but refused to do the same kind of deals with Iceland? Why? And why did the British government impose an anti-terrorist law on Iceland? I discussed this in a report that I wrote for the Icelandic Ministry of Finance, and the question about the Americans is Iceland was not important anymore. It was not strategic anymore. The Americans used to be our supporters and allies, but after the Cold War, we just became dispensable. Iceland became dispensable, unlike the three Scandinavian countries. But I have a hypothesis about the extreme behavior of the British, who closed down the banks and thus brought about the bank collapse, the whole bank collapse, and then imposed an anti-terrorist law on Iceland. I think it was because it was in the political interest of the two people who were leading the British government at the time, Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling, to bring down
Conservatives.
Iceland. No, Labour. Both of them were Labour.
Ah, sorry.
Yes, they were Labour.
Of course.
Well, what was the point? The point was this, that they felt that the power position of the Labour Party was threatened by the success of the nationalists in Scotland. Scotland had long been a power basis for the Labour Party. And both of them, Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling, were Scottish politicians. And in by-elections and also in the political campaigns in the years before the financial crisis, the Scottish nationalists, they said something like this, and this was really the main plank in their program. They said, we have a series of countries, the arc of prosperity, as they called it, going from Ireland through Iceland, through Norway. This was the arc of prosperity. And they said, we should ourselves be members of this arc of prosperity, Norway, Iceland, Ireland. And this annoyed the Labour Party immensely. So, for example, in a book that he wrote about the crisis, Alistair Darling said, now this arc of prosperity has become an arc of insolvency. So it paid for them to bring down Iceland in order to demonstrate to Scottish voters that you couldn't be independent. You had to rely on somebody, just like they could rely on the Bank of England.
Your thesis is that British politicians used Iceland to discipline Scotsmen, right?
Well, rather to demonstrate to the Scottish voters how dangerous independence could be, because they wanted to warn them. So this is my thesis. And
so Iceland was a victim of the political games?
Yes, absolutely. And you see that it was, why on earth, if you just look at it, if you look at the whole absurdity of imposing an anti-terrorist law on a country that doesn't even have a military, Iceland. And I demonstrate in my report that there was no danger of any illegal transfers from the United Kingdom to Iceland, because already a few...
Illegal transfers of what? Of capital?
Of capital, yes.
Of capital.
I mean, that was a nominal point of the imposing the anti-terrorist law on Iceland, that Iceland would be illegally transferring capital, money from the United Kingdom to Iceland, but that had actually been foreclosed or excluded before by special ordinances of the Financial Services Authority in England. So there was no such need to do so. This was just an attempt to knock Iceland down.
So to conclude, Iceland is not a good example of the failures of neoliberalism, because it was not neoliberalism's fault.
Iceland, you know, what happened in Iceland was an example of political corruption, of the abuse of power. Because if you look at it, the anti-terrorist law, which was put into use after the terrorist attacks on the United States in 2001, they had the objective to be against or work against terrorists. But they laid a lot of power in the hands of government. And this power, in the case of Iceland, was, in my opinion, abused to demonstrate to Scottish voters that you couldn't be sustainable on your own. And in a way, it is a true point. It's a correct point. You are not in a credit crunch. You will not survive by yourself. You have to have help from others, and all the others got help. The American Fed helped Denmark and Switzerland, and it has been disclosed that, for example, Danske Bank, which is a large Danish bank, and UBS, the large Swiss bank, would both have gone under if they hadn't received the dollar swap deals.
But was it such a big deal for Fed to help Iceland? I mean, you know, Fed was printing billions of dollars anyway, so why was it a trouble for them to help Iceland too?
That's a very good question. And I think that in the case of the Americans, it was sheer lack of interest.
And in the case they just didn't care, right?
Yes, they didn't care. Iceland was a small, dispensable country. And I think that in this process, Iceland found or discovered a very interesting way of coping with the moral hazard that we have in banking.
Yeah.
The moral hazard that we have in banking is that the bankers, they always use the depositors as hostages. They say to the politicians, if you do not bail us out, then the depositors are going to panic, and there will be street riots, and then the politicians bail them out because of the depositors. But what we did in Iceland was to make the claims of the depositors priority claims on the estates of the banks. So they were not really, had no reason to panic. And we put other creditors actually further behind in the line, in the waiting line, so to speak. And I think this is something that is an excellent idea, because if we have that, if we have the priority of creditors, then we do not need government guarantees of banks, which are, as I agree with you, not really a very good idea, because no private company should have a government guarantee for its operations. It should be the discipline of the market, the system of profit and loss, that governs who survives and who does not. And this principle to protect especially the interests of the creditors by giving them priority claims, I think that is an excellent idea, but it means then that you do not really need to give government guarantees to banks. You shouldn't do that at the same time. So I believe that this was actually a very interesting Icelandic invention, and I think that the story of the Icelandic bank collapse is confirming my neoliberalism and not refuting it.
Okay, Iceland as a country is economic-wise quite free. I checked the Economic Freedom Index by Heritage Foundation, and it's 11th on this index, Iceland. Can you please tell me a bit more on specific sectors of Icelandic economy? Because, you know, we as a Warsaw Enterprise Institute, we are searching for positive role models for our government to copy, or to maybe not copy, but to implement with some adjustments to Polish economy or to Polish institutions. So maybe let's start with healthcare, which is quite important these days, probably more than usual. I'm talking about pandemic, for example. So how does healthcare look in Iceland? Is it private? Is it public? How is it financed? How people get insured, and so on?
It's mixed, but what I would like to do now, because you were talking about the bank collapse, I would like to just say a few words, if I may, on the liberalization of the Icelandic economy that started with Davio Oddssona in 1991.
Yeah, I would like to talk about that too, but a bit later. Let's start about the system, and then we can talk about how this system that is now present was made or put in place. Okay, so maybe please let's sketch through all those important things like healthcare, education, or energy.
But you have to realize, though, that the economic freedom in Iceland increased a lot from 1991 to 2005, let us say. But then it decreased a lot during the bank collapse, and we haven't really regained the same freedom as we had before 2004 or 5. So
All right.
I wouldn't really hold up Iceland as a model, Iceland in 2021.
So
as
it
a
was
model.
free, but is no more.
Well, it's not as free as it was
Okay.
from 1991 to
Okay.
2004. But I'll just give you, I'll just make one point, and I would
All right.
like to emphasize that point. The reason why we were able to sustain this terrible onslaught, the bank collapse, was that the finances of the government were sound and the economy was on strong pillars. You know, because the Icelandic recovery was one of the fastest in the world. Iceland recovered more or less in 5 or 6 years, and now Iceland is, as you correctly point out, one of the most prosperous countries in the world, and it's a very nice little country with very little crime and almost no poverty and those social evils that you see in many other countries.
Okay, so if you can, like I said, tell us a bit more of how those particular sectors, those important sectors of Icelandic economy function, starting from healthcare. Because in Poland it's obligatory, it's paid mostly by the state from special taxes. So how is it being done in Iceland?
Icelandic healthcare is mixed. Some of it is in the private hands and some of it is in public hands, and I wouldn't recommend it at all. I think we should really try to reform the system and open up the possibilities for entrepreneurs to provide medical services.
Okay, so healthcare is like everywhere else.
Yes.
It's pretty much statist
and there seems to be almost a prohibition on discussing the possibility that you would be able to pay for medical services privately.
Okay, education.
Education is mostly run by government, but we introduced a system by which if you have a private school, then the government will pay as much as it would pay for a student in a public school. So there is no discrimination in using taxpayers' money. You can use them to the educational system as well.
Like in this idea of charter schools, education?
Yes, we have that, yes.
Yeah, okay.
But we haven't had many of them, but there are private universities in Iceland, and when my friends
Yours
were in
is
power,
public?
Yes, when my friends were in power, they opened up the possibilities of private schools in both the universities and in other
But
schools.
most Icelanders, they get education from public schools?
Yes.
That's okay. What about the energy? Because energy is an issue also very important today. In Poland, almost every energy company is state-controlled or state-owned. How is that in
Likewise
Iceland?
in Iceland. The energy sector is more or less all run by the municipalities or by government.
Okay, energy. You said that you have no army. No army. But of course you have police, and police is of course public, is a state
Yes,
service.
it is. But there's one thing which is very interesting, and you know, some people might not realize this. I did a study of the pure public goods and their production, and it emerges that the outlays on the police are actually smaller per capita in Iceland than they are in the United Kingdom and in the United States. And they are also quite small in the other Nordic countries, and there is a reason for this. The reason is that these are very peaceful, homogeneous societies, or at least they used to be. And this means that law enforcement is less costly than it is in a more heterogeneous society with a lot of tension and with ghettos and all of that.
You have a lot of Poles, though.
Yes, but they actually, the Poles in Iceland, they conform quite well. There's no problem with them. They are Christian and they are not, you know, alien like perhaps some other nationalities would be that wouldn't fit in as well.
All right, so we talked about healthcare, about energy, about police, about education, and it's pretty much similar to what we have got in Poland, and yet you are 11th on this economic freedom index, and we are like around 14
I
place, I guess.
I personally
So,
think that the other one is
what's the
a
difference?
better measurement. The Fraser Institute Index of Economic Freedom,
Okay.
and we are not as high there. I think that this may be, not a very correct measurement of economic freedom in Iceland. Unfortunately, we do not have the same economic freedom as we had some years ago, but we are still a rather free country, like all the Nordic countries are.
Because you said that the situation changed after the crisis, after 2008, and you have actually less freedom these days than back in 90s, where you've been
Well,
involved.
it's a more complicated thing.
Yeah.
You can say it went up like this when I had some influence in 1991 to 2004, like this.
Yeah.
And we were actually one of the 5 countries in the world where economic freedom increased the most. Then it abruptly went down during the collapse, which is, to be expected because the government had to seize the banks and so on. But then it has been slowly getting up again, but it hasn't reached the same level as it was in say, in 2004.
What about taxes? How do taxes look in Iceland?
Taxes are quite high in Iceland, as they are in the other Scandinavian countries.
So, for example, corporate tax, how high is that?
It is 22%.
It's higher than in Poland. Okay, so what about personal income tax?
Personal income tax it goes from 0 to 37 to 46%. So the marginal income tax is 46%.
40?
46, yes.
Okay. What about VAT?
VAT is there are two kinds of two VATs, one for necessity, so-called, and then for everything else, and one of them is 14% and the other one is 24.5%. So taxes in Iceland are high.
Pretty high.
But they are not as high as they are in Denmark or Sweden, but they are pretty high.
I'm still trying to track this difference between our system and yours, because, what I know about Iceland, I've never been to Iceland, by the way. So what I know about Iceland is what I read in the internet or in some books. And the picture is like, it's a free country. And then you're saying, oh, well, it's free, but not so free. And the difference between Iceland and Poland is quite slight.
Yes, I would say so. It was freer, and it isn't now. There's a lot that could be done. But then, on the other hand, I wouldn't be too concerned about it because Iceland is doing quite well. Iceland is a country of only 330,000 people, and we have good natural resources, and we have a lot of human capital. And I think, therefore, what is really essential is to try to sail on an even keel, to try to continue with the things. Let me put it this way. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I haven't really been trying to force upon Icelandic society any comprehensive liberalization like we did in 1991 to 2004. Then it was necessary to do so. Now it is more that we just have to keep what we have got and try to do the best out of it. Would be my advice.
So, okay, but can you please tell me more about those reforms from 90s that you were involved in? It was during the government of Mr. Davio Oddssona, right?
Yes.
He was kind of Icelandic Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in one person, right?
Absolutely, yes. I'll tell you what we did. I was involved with it. Davio Oddssona is one of my closest friends, and we are still very good friends. And the first thing he did was to cut or abolish all subsidies to companies. So he basically emptied his waiting room, because before then prime ministers had all kinds of funds and special things that they could do for people. And this is something that ceased to exist. So the special funds, regional funds and other funds that had been operated before and had been used politically, basically to buy votes, even if they were supposed to be there for rejuvenating and stimulating the economy. This meant that private companies were now dependent upon the market. They had to produce goods that people wanted. And they had to turn loss into profit. So this was very important. And this was a change in the whole intellectual climate. This is the first thing. The second thing is that we privatized a lot of companies. We privatized not only the banks, but the telephone company and all kinds of companies, a printing press, a travel agency, all kinds of companies that nobody could understand why the government should have been operating them. So there was a wide-ranging, extensive program of privatization.
So privatization and elimination of subsidies.
Yes.
Two elements.
Yes, two elements. The third one was tax cuts, extensive tax cuts. We abolished all special taxes like there was a special tax on accommodation for offices, unlike accommodation for other things, and there was no reason to tax that specially. And then we cut the income tax quite drastically, and the tax on corporations and capital gains, and we also cut the inheritance tax, which had been quite high in many ways before. It became quite low, and these tax cuts they actually were very successful. I can just give you an example. That the corporate tax rate had in about 1990 been about 50%, and it was cut down over the years to 15%. That's actually gone up since then, but it was cut. But the revenue from the tax increased because, of course, there was also economic growth, but it was not only that. The tax base increased. People declared their income and were not manipulating in order to avoid the tax because it was tolerable.
Yeah.
So it was actually a very interesting confirmation of Arthur Laffer's insight that tax revenue can actually increase even if the tax rate is decreasing.
Yeah, well, there's a perfect example that Arthur Laffer was quite right when he, presented the world with his Laffer curve, and it's quite surprising how often this Laffer curve as a concept is ridiculed these days. There are so many examples confirming that it really works, but that's kind of a side topic. I'd like to ask you.
Let me continue though with our reforms
Okay,
because
so
there were
more
very important.
reforms.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh yes, many more. Then we strengthened the pension funds and opened up the possibilities for people to accumulate money in private pension funds and facilitated the whole thing. It had started before, we didn't originate the system, but now the Icelandic pension funds are the strongest, relatively speaking, in the whole world. And then we strengthened and developed further the Icelandic system in the fisheries, which is both profitable and sustainable. So these are all the things that we did, and this had the result that Iceland blossomed, flourished, and was able to withstand the terrible collapse. And what we did, I must also emphasize, what we did, we paid up all the public debt. Iceland was more or less debtless when the bank collapse happened in 2008. And that enabled us or facilitated our recovery.
Quite interesting fragment was about this pensions in Iceland. So they are private now? I mean, the pensions for the retired people?
It's a little bit more complicated than that. There are three kinds of pensions available in Iceland. One is a government pension paid out of the treasury, and that would actually be for those who have no other means, no other pension.
Okay, some basic pension.
Yeah, basic pension. But if you have income from elsewhere and you're a pensioner, then you don't get that pension, or very little of it. So it is reduced, or basically doesn't really happen if you have some other income, tolerable income. So it is more for those that have been left behind by the system. then the main source of pensions is the professional pension funds. For example, the government employees have one pension fund,
Okay.
and engineers have another one, and then one profession after another. They've got their pension funds, and what we did was to, it used to be only 10%, 6% from the employer and 4% from the worker, but we made it voluntary for people to pay more into the pension fund, and then it was tax-free at the time when it was being paid into the pension fund, although you pay tax on the pension afterwards. Then thirdly, you have the private pension accounts, and they are fully inheritable, and they are your private property. And once you reach the pension age, then you can take it all out if you want to.
All right.
So we have three kinds of pensions in
So
Iceland.
3 pillars.
And yes, and what is the result? Not only that the pension funds are the strongest in probably in the world, but also that poverty amongst the old is in Iceland the least in all of the European countries, according to measurements and according to the European Statistical Bureau.
You are quite a small country, though. It's probably easier to implement such reforms on such a grand scale in a small country than in Poland. When in a small country, there's probably also a lot more of social cohesion. How do people remember Mr. Oddssona these days in Iceland? How is he perceived as a savior, as a great reformer? It's probably easy to say because there's only 360,000 people in Iceland.
I think that Oddssona was an extremely successful politician. He really vanquished his opponents. You know, he was prime minister for almost 14 years, and before that he had been mayor of Reykjavik for 9 years.
Yeah.
So he was an extremely successful politician. And his liberalization program was very successful, as could be seen when we had the bank collapse. It is really the best witness to it. But after he was prime minister, he became governor of the central bank. And he was governor of the central bank during the bank collapse. So many people blamed him for the bank collapse, unjustly, but he was at the helm of the ship when this happened.
Okay.
And this means that in Iceland, opinion about Oddssona is very divided. You know, some people admire him.
50-50?
Yes, I would think so.
50-50, okay. I'd like also to talk about your book, the book that we don't have here, but it's easy to find in the internet. It's titled 24 Classical Conservatives.
No, it was called 24 conservative liberal thinkers.
Sorry.
Yes. And
yeah, and yeah, there are 24 of them, obviously, in the book. But I'd like to ask you about your favorite one, Hayek, probably.
Yes, I would think that I'm mostly a Hayekian. I did my doctoral dissertation on Hayek, and I got to know Hayek quite well, and he was a wonderful person, but also a very deep and penetrating thinker. So.
Yeah, because recently I got into this argument on whether conservative liberalism is a concept that is kind of legitimate or maybe is self-contradictory. How do you perceive this discussion? Because Hayek was not also, he was of course conservative liberal in a sense, but he himself was claiming that, you know, rules are something that is evolving all the time in the social process, likewise in the evolution mechanism. So this is not kind of a conservatism traditionally understood. So what do you understand by this term, and how would you defend that it is not a self-contradictory term?
Well, Hayek himself, he said, I'm not a conservative. He wrote about that, and he was not a conservative. But he was conservative as an adjective, not as a noun. That is to say, he was a classical liberal, but he was conservative in that he recognized certain insights from the conservative tradition, namely that we should prefer evolution to revolution, and we should honor and respect the civic society of family and property and hierarchy to some extent. And you can actually put Hayek's theory in one question, summing it up. And the question is, how is it that we have this flourishing, diverse, creative civilization at the same time as we recognize the ignorance of individuals? How are we able to have this civilization? What is the accomplishment? And his answer is that we have this civilization, the Western civilization, and all its creativity and freedom, because we enable people to use the knowledge of one another. And we do that mainly through the price system, but also through traditions, settled ways of doing things, enabling continuity and predictability. And this is both a conservative and a liberal insight. Because if you recall, conservatives have always emphasized how small man is in comparison to God or to the laws or so on. They're absolutely right about that. But they are small because their knowledge is limited, and their knowledge can be extended if we use the price system, the free market, and other spontaneously developed orders. And this is Hayek's great contribution. That he has in common, of course, in many ways with Adam Smith and Karl Menger and others that have written about this, that we have this extended order. Hayek speaks about the extended order. Karl Popper, he speaks about the open society. Michael Oakeshott speaks about civil association. And old Adam Smith spoke about the great society, and they're all trying to describe a society which is based on what I would call social reason, not only individual reason, which is very limited, but social reason, which is basically all the things that we are able to use without having them.
There's this interesting tension between conservatism and liberalism. In Poland, the free market capitalism or free market movement has been always married to the conservatism, but not in Hayekian sense, rather in this traditional religious sense. So people who are in favor of free market in Poland, they are very much in favor of traditional institutions like church, traditional values. They are, against those social innovations like, for example, gay marriages and so on. And this is kind of it goes hand in hand here in Poland. In some other countries it's different. But the thing is, right now, there are some people claiming that, well, in order to, make liberal ideas more popular, you need to split conservatism and liberalism, or free market liberalism, into two separate things in order to get more people into being in favor of free market. Young people who are not conservative in the traditional sense, right? Do you think that in the long run, this traditional, not Hayekian conservatism is in contradiction with free market?
I strongly believe actually in the alliance between conservatives and classical liberals. Although I also believe that the difference between them is that being conservative is a disposition. It's just, you want stability and continuity. And you really do not have a political theory to back up these dispositions of yours. I think that Hayek and Friedman and others, they have a very strong social and political and economic theory to back up their views. And in Hayek's case, it is the theory of spontaneous order. Now, you're absolutely right that most people, they want to make use of tradition and the family. But for example, take just gay marriage. Wouldn't that really be a reaffirmation of the conservative ideal of a family? shouldn't really conservatives be in favor of it? Because if you look at gay life in the past, usually gays were rebels.
Yeah.
They were very promiscuous. There was a kind of a frenzy, madness. But if they are in marriage relationships, they will become stable and they will become a part of society instead of rejecting society. So I think a true conservative ought to be in favor of gay marriage. And a true conservative should also say with St. Thomas Aquinas, to take one example, St. Thomas Aquinas, and I discuss it in my book, he said, man is an imperfect being. He commits many sins. The police should not go after his sins which are not harming anyone.
Okay.
The police should only go after the sins of man that are harming other people, like fraud and violence. We should leave alone what people do themselves privately. Therefore, I believe that we should tolerate prostitution and pornography, to take two examples, and gambling and all kinds of such things. We shouldn't necessarily endorse them or condone them or applaud them, but we should tolerate them and allow them and use the scarce resources of the state, namely the police and the judicial system, to go after the activities which are harmful for other people. And I think this is both a liberal and a conservative position.
Okay, so to sum it up, there is a need to review the term or the notion of conservatism, because, like I told you before, people do not see it the way that you just presented it. People see very,
yes.
in a rigid sense. Conservatism is family.
I think personally that it is essential for society to have institutions like the church and the family and property and spontaneous associations. And this is, I described this in the chapter on Tocqueville in my book. Tocqueville wanted to know how we could sort of perform the function that the aristocracy performed in France before the revolution. And he said that spontaneous associations like religion and so on did so. And the worry of many of the classical liberals like Adam Smith and Tocqueville was, if we have economic freedom and the people go from the countryside to the city and so on, they might immerse themselves in sinful living and they may become corrupted because man is a frail being. So what is the remedy? Adam Smith said there are two remedies more or less. One is education, which has to be provided to all. But the other one is associations, spontaneous associations. And I discussed it at length in my book. Take, for example, if you arrive in New York and take a taxi into Manhattan, and there you are, and you see this, and you feel it is like a human jungle, where nobody is helpful to anyone else, nobody is caring, all is cold, and so on. This is not at all so, because if you live in New York for a while, then you see that underneath this rather Spartan, austere surface, there are several communities and organizations of many kinds, like say the Irish community with their bars where they gather together and sing Irish songs, and the Wall Street community with a strict codes of conduct, and all kinds of other communities. So what is essential for those 24 conservative liberal thinkers that I have identified is that between the individual and the state, there is also a vibrant civic culture.
And this is something outstanding when you think of how free market liberalism is usually presented or described. It's usually said to be very atomistic, that it's fragmentizing people, it's dividing people, separating people from each other. In your perspective, it's totally opposite. It's about cooperation, about social circles.
Yes, but you see, at the same time, as the free market or capitalism breaks up certain relationships, because they are, obsolete in some way or another, it forms new relationships. Take Romeo and Juliet, that may be in some ways the first individuals. They cease to be a Montague or a Capulet, they become Romeo and Juliet. They defy their families. They don't define themselves in terms of the collective into which they were born. And this is the individualism of the Renaissance and the individualism of modern times, that, each family that's formed is a family that is new. It means that you break out from your old family, from your mother and your father, and you form a new family. That's one way of putting it. And then we have also, as I say, the church, because I think man is a frail being. And if he doesn't believe that God is looking over his shoulder, he is going to do all kinds of things that he shouldn't do.
That is the kind of economic interview I prefer. We start from Balzac, we end with Shakespeare, right? Thank you very much, Professor, for your time and for this talk. Thank you.
Thank you.